There is a place on the map that most people couldn't find without help. It sits between the southern tip of Iran and the northern coast of Oman, a narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Indian Ocean and the rest of the world. At its widest, it stretches roughly 90 miles across. At its narrowest, just 21 miles separate two coastlines that have defined the fate of the global economy for half a century. It's called the Strait of Hormuz. And for most of history, it was an unremarkable geographic feature, a shipping lane, one of many that tankers used to move oil from the Gulf to the world. Then, the world became dependent on what passes through it, and everything changed. To understand what happened in 2026, you need to understand what this strait actually is, not as a line on a map, but as a structural fact about how modern civilization is organized. The numbers first. Roughly 20% of all petroleum traded globally passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single year. That's not 20% of oil from one region. That's 20% of all oil that crosses borders anywhere on Earth. Add to that approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, the fuel that heats homes, powers factories, and generates electricity across Europe and Asia. And you begin to understand the scale of what flows through those 21 miles. Before the conflict began, approximately 3,000 vessels used the strait every month. Supertankers carrying 2 million barrels of crude. Lane carriers the length of 3 football fields, container ships, bulk carriers, chemical tankers. A constant procession day and night, month after month, year after year. This traffic feeds the economies of Japan, South Korea, China, India, the European Union. It fuels the fighter jets and naval vessels of the United States military. It heats homes in Germany and powers manufacturing in Taiwan. There is no substitute route. The alternative, around the southern tip of Africa, adds weeks to every journey and billions to every calculation. The strait is, in the most literal sense, a choke point. Remove it from the global supply chain, and the chain breaks. Now look at the geography more carefully. The navigable channels through the strait, the lanes where ships can actually transit safely, are each only 2 miles wide. 2 miles. In a strait that spans 21 miles at its narrowest, the usable water is a fraction of what the map suggests. Those channels run through Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Iran controls the northern bank. The deepest, most navigable water runs close to the Iranian coast. This is not an accident of geography that strategists overlooked. It's a fact that Iranian military planners have understood for decades. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most powerful military force. Distinct from the regular army and reporting directly to the supreme leader, built its entire naval doctrine around this single reality. Small, fast boats. Anti-ship missiles. Mines, drones, the capacity to make those 2-mile channels impassable without ever engaging a U.S. aircraft carrier in open water. The strategy isn't to win a naval battle. It's to make the cost of winning too high for anyone else. This is what changed on February 28, 2026. Within hours of the initial strikes, Iran activated what it had been preparing for years. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. Not symbolically, not partially. The combination of Iranian naval vessels, mines, drone swarms, and anti-ship missile batteries made transit effectively impossible for commercial shipping. Insurance rates for vessels attempting the passage became prohibitive overnight. Shipping companies pulled their fleets. The tankers stopped moving. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. According to data compiled by the World Trade Organization in the weeks that followed, crude oil shipments through the strait fell by approximately 95%. Liquefied natural gas shipments fell by 99%. 3,000 vessels a month became almost none. Oil prices, which had already been elevated by months of regional tension, moved sharply higher. The effects cascaded outward immediately, into gasoline prices, into fertilizer costs, into the price of food, into the inflation numbers that governments track and voters feel. Every economy on Earth that runs on imported energy absorbed the shock. Some more than others. But none escaped it entirely. What the closure revealed was something that military planners had understood in theory, but the public had never fully absorbed. Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily to impose unbearable costs on the United States economically. It doesn't need to sink a carrier strike group. It doesn't need to launch missiles at American cities. It needs to keep 21 miles of water closed long enough for the economic pressure to become politically untenable in Washington, in allied capitals, in the home countries of every government that depends on Gulf energy. This is the asymmetry at the heart of the 2026 conflict. The United States had overwhelming military superiority. Iran had geographic leverage. And geographic leverage, in this case, turned out to be worth more than anyone publicly acknowledged before the war began. There's a deeper layer here that matters for everything that follows. The Strait's power as a weapon isn't new. Iranian leaders have threatened to close it for decades. After every round of sanctions, every diplomatic confrontation, every military buildup in the Gulf, the threat was there, explicit, repeated, sometimes dismissed as bluster. The United States spent years developing contingency plans. Naval assets were positioned in the region specifically to counter an Iranian closure attempt. And yet when the closure came, the contingencies weren't enough, not because American military power had failed. The US and Israeli air campaign inflicted severe damage on Iranian military infrastructure. It eliminated senior leadership. It degraded Iran's conventional military capacity substantially. By almost any conventional measure, the military objectives were being achieved. But the Strait stayed closed. And that changed the entire calculation, because the question was never whether the United States could eventually reopen the Strait by force. It probably could. The question was what the global economy would look like by the time that happened, and whether the political will to sustain that cost existed in a country where inflation was already accelerating, midterm elections were approaching, and the public had been promised, repeatedly, that there would be no new Middle Eastern wars. The Strait of Hormuz turned out to be exactly what geography always suggested it was. Not just a shipping lane, not just a trade route, a lever. And Iran, for all the damage it absorbed in those first 12 hours, still had its hand on it. That is the foundation of everything that followed. Wars are easier to start than to define. And the 2026 conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran is a case study in what happens when the stated objectives of a military campaign exceed what military force can actually deliver, and when the gap between those two things isn't acknowledged until the cost of closing it becomes politically unacceptable. To understand the deal that ended the war, you have to understand what the war was supposed to accomplish, and why those goals, whatever the military outcome on the ground, were never going to be achieved by airstrikes alone. 3 objectives. 3 problems. When the strikes began on February 28, 2026, the stated goals were explicit. They were repeated by officials, outlined in public statements, and framed as the conditions under which military operations would cease. The first objective was the elimination of Iran's nuclear program, not containment, not limitation, not a negotiated cap on enrichment. Elimination, The physical destruction of the infrastructure Iran had spent decades building, the centrifuge halls, the enrichment facilities, the weaponization research sites, the stockpiles of enriched uranium accumulated since the collapse of the previous nuclear agreement. The second objective was the destruction of Iran's ballistic missile program, the arsenal of medium and long-range missiles that could reach Israel, U.S. bases across the region, and potentially targets far beyond the Middle East. Again, not limitation. Destruction, the third objective, the one that generated the most controversy and the least official clarity, was regime change. The removal of the Islamic Republic as a governing system and its replacement with something different, something that by implication would not threaten its neighbors, would not support armed groups across the region, and would not pursue nuclear weapons. These were the objectives. Now examine what military force could realistically deliver against each one. The nuclear problem. Destroying nuclear infrastructure from the air is one of the most technically complex challenges in modern warfare. Facilities can be buried. Equipment can be dispersed. Knowledge cannot be bombed. The scientists who understand how to enrich uranium, how to design centrifuge cascades, how to handle fissile material, they exist independently of any building that can be targeted from altitude. Iran's nuclear program in early 2026 was not a collection of a few visible sites that could be eliminated in a single campaign. It was a distributed network built over 40 years, hardened after previous Israeli strikes in earlier decades, with key facilities buried under hundreds of feet of rock specifically to survive aerial bombardment. Even with the most sophisticated bunker-penetrating munitions available, the question of whether the physical destruction of known sites would actually eliminate the program, rather than simply delay it, was one that weapons analysts had debated for years without resolution. What the strikes could do, and did, was damage facilities, destroy equipment, and disrupt operations. What they could not do was eliminate the knowledge base, the human expertise, or Iran's fundamental capacity to reconstitute those capabilities over time. A country that has enriched uranium to 90% weapons grade has demonstrated that it understands the physics and the engineering. That understanding doesn't disappear when a building collapses. The missile problem. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal presented a different but equally difficult challenge. Unlike nuclear facilities, which are fixed and relatively few, missiles are mobile, dispersible, and numerous. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had spent years developing the capacity to move launchers rapidly, conceal them in urban environments, and launch from locations that were difficult to identify in advance. Destroying a missile in a hardened facility is a tractable military problem. Destroying every launcher, every fuel depot, every spare part, every trained crew across a country the size of Western Europe is something else entirely. The strikes degraded Iran's missile capacity. They did not eliminate it. The hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones that Iran launched in retaliation against Israel, against U.S. bases, against Gulf state infrastructure, were the visible proof that the program had survived the opening campaign in sufficient form to remain a credible threat throughout the conflict. The regime change problem. This was always the most ambitious objective, and the one with the least historical support. The theory, stated plainly, was this: remove the supreme leader, destroy the military capacity of the Revolutionary Guard, and the Islamic Republic would collapse or transform under the weight of its own failures and the aspirations of its population. The theory had a logic to it. Iran's population had demonstrated, repeatedly and at great personal cost, a willingness to challenge the government. Economic conditions before the war were severe. Sanctions had compressed living standards for years. The regime's legitimacy, particularly among younger Iranians, had been eroding for more than a decade. But there's a difference between a population that opposes its government and a population that benefits from foreign military intervention replacing it. Those are not the same political condition, and the history of externally imposed regime change in the modern era, across the Middle East and elsewhere, offered very little evidence that airstrikes produce the kind of political transformation that planners envision when they write the phrase into an objective statement. What happened instead followed a pattern that history had already demonstrated multiple times. The death of the supreme leader on the first day of the conflict did not produce chaos. An interim leadership structure was established within 24 hours. His son was named successor within days. The Revolutionary Guard, which had always operated as a parallel power structure to the clerical leadership, found itself in a position of increased authority, not diminished. The external attack, rather than fracturing the regime's internal coherence, provided it with exactly the kind of threat that authoritarian systems historically use to consolidate power, suppress internal dissent, and frame survival as patriotic duty. The regime didn't fall. It hardened, and a hardened regime with geographic leverage is a fundamentally different negotiating problem than a weakened regime being offered a way out. Here is the structural reality that the opening of the war obscured. Military success and strategic success are not the same thing. The strikes of February 28 achieved military success by almost any conventional measure. The most protected leadership in the Middle East was eliminated. Facilities were destroyed. The conventional military capacity of one of the region's most capable armed forces was significantly degraded in a single day. But strategic success requires converting military outcomes into political results. And political results require either the complete collapse of the adversary, which didn't happen, or a negotiated settlement in which both sides can claim enough of what they wanted to justify stopping. Neither the United States nor Iran achieved its maximum objectives. The US did not get regime change, did not eliminate the nuclear program, did not destroy the missile arsenal. Iran did not repel the strikes, lost its supreme leader, absorbed enormous damage to its military and economic infrastructure. What both sides had, by the time the negotiations that produced the June 2026 agreement began in earnest, was a clear picture of what continued fighting would cost, and a growing recognition that the gap between what each side wanted and what each side could realistically extract through force was not going to close, no matter how many additional strikes were conducted. That recognition is what produced the deal. Not victory, not defeat. The exhaustion of maximalist objectives against the reality of what war can and cannot deliver. This pattern, ambitious war aims, military success, strategic stalemate, negotiated compromise, is not unique to 2026. It is one of the defining features of modern conflict, and understanding why it keeps repeating requires looking at what happened to the side that absorbed the most damage and still didn't break. There is a concept in systems theory called anti-fragility. The idea is simple but counterintuitive. Some systems don't just survive stress, they get stronger because of it. The stress reorganizes them, eliminates their weakest elements, and forces adaptations that wouldn't have occurred in stable conditions. It's a concept that was developed to describe financial systems and biological organisms, but it describes what happened to the Iranian regime in 2026 with uncomfortable precision. Before the war began, the Islamic Republic was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Decades of sanctions had compressed the economy. The currency had lost a substantial portion of its value over the preceding years. Youth unemployment was severe. A series of domestic uprisings in 2019, in 2022, and again in 2024 had demonstrated that large portions of the population were willing to take significant personal risks to challenge the government publicly. The clerical establishment that had governed Iran since 1979 was aging, increasingly disconnected from a population that was young, urban, and networked in ways the founders of the revolution never anticipated. The theory that external military pressure might accelerate an internal collapse had a surface logic. The conditions for instability were real. What the theory missed was the difference between a system under pressure and a system under attack. Those are not the same political condition, and the Islamic Republic, whatever its failures and contradictions, had spent 45 years developing the institutional capacity to convert external threats into internal cohesion. What happened on February 28 triggered exactly that mechanism. The assassination of the supreme leader. The defining act of the opening hours of the conflict was designed to decapitate the regime's decision-making structure and create a power vacuum that would be difficult to fill quickly enough to mount an organized response. It didn't work that way. Within 24 hours of the strikes, an interim leadership council had been established. Within days, a successor had been named. The son of the man who had led Iran for nearly 4 decades. The transition was not seamless. There were clearly tensions within the system about who would hold authority and on what basis. But the system held. It didn't fragment. It didn't produce competing factions that fought each other while the external pressure mounted. The reason it held is structural and worth understanding clearly. The Islamic Republic was never a simple clerical dictatorship with power concentrated in a single individual. It was, and remains, a layered system with multiple centers of power operating in parallel. The Supreme Leader's Office, the Revolutionary Guard, the regular military, the intelligence services, the judiciary, the elected government, and the network of religious foundations that control significant portions of the economy. These institutions compete with each other constantly, but they share a common interest in the system's survival that overrides their internal competition when the system itself is under existential threat. The Revolutionary Guard is the key institution here. It was established specifically as a parallel military structure loyal to the revolution rather than to any particular leader or government. It controls missile forces, naval assets in the Gulf, intelligence operations, and a significant portion of the Iranian economy through its business empire. When the supreme leader was killed, the Revolutionary Guard didn't lose its chain of command. It had its own. And that chain of command was functioning and launching retaliatory strikes within hours of the opening attacks. What emerged from the first weeks of the conflict was a regime that looked different from the one that had existed before. The clerical establishment, the scholars and jurists who had dominated Iranian governance since 1979, and who had always served as the ideological legitimizing force of the system, found itself in a secondary position relative to the military commanders who were actually managing the war. This wasn't a sudden shift. It had been developing for years as the Revolutionary Guard accumulated economic power and political influence. The war accelerated it dramatically. Analysts who watched Iranian governance closely described the transition using a phrase that captures it precisely: from divine power to hard power. The legitimacy of the Islamic Republic had always rested partly on religious authority. The concept that governance derived from God through the supreme leader as the representative of hidden religious authority. That framework didn't disappear. But it was increasingly supplemented, and in practice often displaced, by a more straightforward claim to power rooted in military capability, organizational effectiveness, and the demonstrated ability to impose costs on enemies. This is a more durable form of authoritarian power in some ways. It doesn't require ideological conviction from the population. It requires only the recognition that the system has the capacity to defend itself and to make the cost of challenging it prohibitive. The population's response to the conflict was more complex than either side anticipated. Among Iranians who had been most vocal in opposing the regime, activists, journalists, the educated urban class that had led the domestic uprisings of previous years, the war produced a deeply uncomfortable split. Opposition to the government and opposition to foreign military strikes on Iranian soil are not the same sentiment. Many people who had taken significant personal risks to challenge the Islamic Republic from within found themselves unable to welcome an American and Israeli military campaign as liberation. The families of thousands of Iranians arrested during previous uprisings feared, with historical justification, that the end of the war would produce a domestic crackdown rather than an opening. Authoritarian regimes that survive external military pressure frequently respond by intensifying internal repression, framing the survival of the state as requiring the elimination of internal dissent. The concern was not abstract. It was grounded in the documented pattern of how the Islamic Republic had behaved after every previous period of external pressure. Outside Iran's borders, the regime's survival produced a specific effect on the groups it had spent decades cultivating. The network of armed organizations that Tehran had built and sustained across the region, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Gaza, watched the conflict and drew conclusions. A regime that had survived coordinated American and Israeli strikes, that had maintained enough military capacity to keep the world's most critical shipping lane closed for months, that had forced the most powerful military alliance in history to the negotiating table. That regime's credibility as a patron and protector was not diminished by the war. In some respects, it was enhanced. This created a paradox at the center of the June 2026 agreement that no amount of careful drafting could resolve. The deal required Iran to cease military operations. It did not, could not, sever the relationships between Tehran and the organizations it had built over decades. The infrastructure of influence that Iran had constructed across the region was not a military asset that could be destroyed from the air or bargained away in 60 days of negotiations. It was a political and social network embedded in communities, funded through channels that predated the conflict, and sustained by relationships that would outlast any memorandum of understanding. The regime that emerged from the 2026 war was harder, more militarized, more risk-tolerant, and more convinced of its own durability than the one that existed before February 28. It had absorbed the worst its enemies could deliver in the opening hours of the conflict. It had lost its supreme leader. It had taken severe damage to its military infrastructure, its economy, and its civilian population. It had watched portions of its territory devastated by the most sophisticated air campaign ever mounted against it. And it was still there, still functioning, still negotiating from a position that required the other side to make concessions. That is the reality that the June 2026 agreement reflects. Not an Iran that was defeated and accepted terms, an Iran that was damaged and accepted a pause, with the clear understanding that its fundamental leverage, the geographic choke point that it controlled, and that the rest of the world needed, had survived the war intact. The deal was possible because both sides had learned something. What Iran learned was that it could survive a direct American military campaign. That knowledge, and the confidence it produces, will shape Iranian decision-making for a generation. What the United States learned, or should have learned, is more complicated. And it connects directly to the economic pressures that ultimately drove Washington to the table faster than any military calculation suggested it would need to. Wars are decided by soldiers, but they are ended by economies. This has been true across modern history, and the 2026 conflict between the United States and Iran demonstrated the principle with a clarity that should surprise no one who has studied how military campaigns interact with domestic political conditions. The mechanism that ultimately drove Washington toward a negotiated settlement wasn't a military reversal. It wasn't a diplomatic breakthrough. It was the price of gasoline, the cost of food, the number that appears on an inflation report and travels within hours from a government statistics office to every household in the country. To understand why the United States moved toward a deal when it did, you have to trace the economic chain that connected a closed shipping lane in the Persian Gulf to a kitchen table in Ohio. That chain is shorter, faster, and more politically potent than most people appreciate until they feel it personally. Start with the commodity shock. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's petroleum. When it closed on February 28, 2026, that supply didn't disappear immediately. The global oil market has buffers, strategic reserves, and alternative sources that cushion the initial impact of any supply disruption. But buffers are finite. Strategic reserves exist to buy time, not to replace permanent supply. And the closure wasn't temporary. It extended for weeks, then months, with no clear endpoint visible to the markets that price these commodities every hour of every trading day. Oil markets don't wait for supply disruptions to fully materialize before pricing them in. They price in expectations, and the expectation that 20% of global petroleum supply would remain inaccessible for an indefinite period, with active military operations making the timeline impossible to predict, was sufficient to drive prices sharply and immediately higher. The effects cascaded outward from there, with a logic that is mechanical rather than political. Higher oil prices mean higher transportation costs for everything that moves by truck, train, or ship, which is nearly everything that humans buy. Higher transportation costs mean higher prices at the point of sale. Higher prices at the point of sale mean inflation. And inflation, once it becomes embedded in the expectations of businesses and consumers, is extraordinarily difficult to arrest without causing additional economic damage through the interest rate increases that central banks use to fight it. The United States economy in early 2026 was not well positioned to absorb this shock. Inflation had been a persistent political problem for years. The cost of living had risen substantially from pre-pandemic levels, and had never fully returned to the baseline that most American households used as their reference point for economic normalcy. Food prices, housing costs, and energy expenses had all moved in directions that made the standard of living measurably more difficult for the majority of American households, particularly those without significant financial assets to cushion the impact. Against this backdrop, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the resulting commodity shock hit an economy that was already under stress. Gasoline prices moved higher within days of the conflict beginning. Food prices followed, because food production and distribution are energy intensive at every stage. From the natural gas used to produce fertilizer, to the diesel that powers farm equipment, to the fuel that moves agricultural products from farm to processing facility to retail outlet. The inflation rate, which had been slowly trending in a direction that suggested it might finally be returning to levels the central bank considered acceptable, reversed course. Within weeks of the conflict beginning, the numbers were moving in the wrong direction again, and moving faster than they had in years. Here is where the political dimension becomes impossible to separate from the economic one. The United States holds midterm congressional elections in November 2026. This is not a detail. It is the central fact of American domestic politics for the first 2 years of any presidential term, and it shapes every calculation made in the executive branch about what policies are sustainable and what political costs can be absorbed. The historical pattern is consistent and well documented. When inflation is high and rising in the months before a midterm election, the party holding the White House loses seats. Not always, not mechanically. But the correlation between economic discomfort and electoral punishment for the incumbent party is one of the most reliable relationships in American political history. The administration was aware of this. It would have been impossible not to be. Consumer confidence surveys, polling data, and the economic coverage that dominates domestic news media all pointed in the same direction. The public wasn't behind the war, had never been particularly behind the war, and was becoming increasingly vocal about the economic consequences of a conflict that seemed to have no clear endpoint and no defined victory condition that the average household could recognize. The promise, stated clearly and repeatedly before the conflict began, was that there would be no new Middle Eastern wars. That promise had been broken. The supplementary promise that any conflict would be short, decisive, and would not impose significant economic costs on American households was also being broken, visibly and in real time, every time someone filled a gas tank or checked out at a grocery store. The president's own communications reflected this pressure in ways that were legible even through the careful framing of official statements. Posts on social media during the weeks before the deal was reached showed an escalating frustration that was directed not only at Iran, but at Israel, specifically at the military actions that were complicating the diplomatic track and extending the timeline of the conflict. The language was not the language of a commander confident in the trajectory of a military campaign. It was the language of a political actor watching a situation that was generating domestic costs faster than it was producing the resolution that would end those costs. When the markets reacted positively to signals that a deal might be close, when oil prices dropped on reports of diplomatic progress and rose again when those reports turned out to be premature, the correlation wasn't lost on the people responsible for managing both the conflict and the political calendar. There is a broader structural point here that extends beyond the specifics of 2026. The United States is the world's largest economy and, by most measures, its most powerful military. But economic power and military power interact in ways that create vulnerabilities as well as strengths. A country whose economic performance is politically consequential on a 2-year electoral cycle has a structural time horizon problem when it comes to conflicts that don't resolve quickly. Iran understood this asymmetry. It had studied it for decades. The Islamic Republic had survived American sanctions, American proxy support for its enemies, American military buildups in the Gulf, and American diplomatic isolation. The consistent lesson from each of those episodes was that the United States, for all its power, operates under domestic political constraints that limit how long and at what cost it can sustain pressure on a determined adversary. Closing the Strait of Hormuz was not just a military response to the February 28 strikes. It was a calculated application of the one form of leverage that Iran possessed that could interact directly with American domestic politics, the capacity to impose economic pain on American households at a moment when those households were already experiencing economic discomfort and were scheduled in 8 months to render a political verdict on the party that had started the war. The deal that emerged in June 2026 was, at its core, an energy price deal. The immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, announced by the president himself in his Truth Social post, framed in the language of commerce rather than diplomacy, addressed directly to the ships waiting to transit, was the single most economically significant element of the agreement. Everything else, the nuclear negotiations, the sanctions framework, the questions about Iranian proxies and ballistic missiles, those were deferred to the 60-day negotiating period that would follow. The strait reopened first. because the strait was what the economic pressure was about. And the economic pressure was what had made the deal politically necessary. This sequence, military action, economic consequences, political pressure, diplomatic settlement, is not unique to 2026. It is a template. And recognizing it as a template is the first step toward understanding why the next major conflict involving critical infrastructure or global supply chains is likely to follow a similar arc, regardless of who the parties are or what the stated objectives happen to be. The soldiers fight, the economists keep score, and the politicians, eventually, make the call. In 2026, that call came from a specific combination of pressures that had been building since February. The economic dimension was the most powerful of them. But it wasn't the only one, because while Washington was calculating the domestic cost of the conflict, a parallel drama was unfolding in the corridors of power across the region. In Islamabad, in Doha, in Riyadh, and in Ankara, where a set of actors most people had never thought of as central to American foreign policy were quietly becoming indispensable. When the history of the 2026 conflict is written with the distance of years, one of its most consequential chapters will not be about the missiles or the oil prices or the negotiations in Geneva. It will be about a structural shift in how international diplomacy functions. A shift that was visible to specialists for years before the conflict made it impossible to ignore. The deal that ended the war between the United States and Iran was not brokered by the United Nations. It was not produced by the permanent members of the Security Council sitting together in a room. It was not the result of direct back-channel communication between Washington and Tehran through the traditional diplomatic architecture that had managed great power relations for the better part of a century. It was brokered by Pakistan, with significant contributions from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. This fact, unremarkable to anyone who follows the mechanics of contemporary diplomacy, startling to anyone who doesn't, deserves examination. Not because it reflects well or badly on any of the parties involved, but because it reveals something important about how power is actually distributed in the international system of the 2020s, and why that distribution looks increasingly different from the one that dominated the second half of the 20th century. Start with the question of why direct communication between Washington and Tehran was structurally impossible. The United States and Iran have not had formal diplomatic relations since 1980. That's not a gap in communication. It's a 46-year institutional absence. There are no embassies. There are no resident ambassadors. There are no established protocols for direct government-to-government contact at the level required to negotiate a framework that ends an active military conflict. This doesn't mean the two governments never communicate. They do, through various channels: third-country intermediaries, back-channel contacts, messages passed through diplomatic missions in countries where both maintain representation. But these channels are informal, slow, and subject to the constant risk of misinterpretation when the margin for error is measured in missile strikes and oil price movements rather than diplomatic communiques. In a conflict where the situation on the ground was changing daily, where a strike on Beirut one afternoon could collapse a negotiating session that had taken weeks to arrange, the need for reliable, trusted, real-time communication between parties that couldn't talk directly to each other was not an abstract diplomatic preference. It was an operational necessity. Pakistan occupied a position that made it uniquely suited to fill that role. The relationship between Pakistan and the United States is long, complicated, and frequently troubled. But it is never broken entirely. Pakistan hosts American diplomatic facilities, has a history of intelligence cooperation with Washington, and has significant leverage with the United States through the strategic geography of South Asia. At the same time, Pakistan has maintained consistent diplomatic and commercial relationships with Iran. including during periods when most Western nations were applying maximum pressure through sanctions. The two countries share a long border, significant trade relationships, and a complex history of cooperation and competition. This dual positioning, trusted enough by Washington to carry messages, credible enough to Tehran to be received seriously, is exactly what a mediator needs. And Pakistan's military establishment, which exercises decisive influence over foreign policy in ways that formal civilian structures sometimes don't fully reflect, had both the relationships and the institutional capacity to move quickly between the two capitals. The military chief's repeated trips to Tehran during the negotiating period were not ceremonial. They were operational, carrying specific proposals, receiving specific responses, clarifying specific ambiguities in draft language that could mean the difference between an agreement and a collapse. This is the unglamorous mechanical work of actual diplomacy, the kind that doesn't produce press conferences or photo opportunities, but that determines whether the language on a page means the same thing to both parties signing it. Qatar's role was different, but equally structural. The small Gulf state has spent decades building a diplomatic identity specifically designed to give it relevance and security in a neighborhood dominated by much larger powers. Its strategy has been consistent: maintain relationships with parties that are in conflict with each other, offer territory and resources as a neutral ground for communication, and build the institutional reputation of a reliable interlocutor that neither side has reason to distrust. Qatar hosts one of the largest American military installations in the Middle East, the Al Udeid Air Base, which served as a critical logistics hub for American operations throughout the conflict. It simultaneously maintained diplomatic communication with Iran. It had previously served as a back channel for American negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, with Hamas in Gaza, and with various other parties in conflicts where direct American engagement was politically or diplomatically impossible. This track record matters. Mediators are not interchangeable. The value of a particular intermediary comes from the accumulated trust of parties who have worked with them before in difficult circumstances and found them to be reliable. Qatar had built that trust through years of patient, consistent engagement, sometimes criticized in Western capitals as too accommodating to parties those capitals preferred to isolate, but ultimately producing the institutional credibility that made Qatar indispensable when a channel was needed that both Washington and Tehran would use. Saudi Arabia's contribution to the mediation reflects a different kind of leverage. The kingdom had its own complex relationship with both parties. Its relationship with the United States is foundational. The security architecture of the Gulf has been built around American protection and Saudi oil since the middle of the 20th century. Its relationship with Iran is defined by decades of competition for regional influence, sectarian tension, and a series of proxy conflicts that have cost both countries significant resources and human lives. But Saudi Arabia had a direct interest in an outcome that reopened the Strait of Hormuz and restored some degree of stability to the Gulf. The conflict had disrupted Saudi oil exports, damaged infrastructure in neighboring states, and created a regional security environment that threatened the economic transformation the kingdom had been attempting to implement. A deal that ended the shooting, even a deal that left significant questions unresolved, served Saudi interests in ways that continuing the conflict did not. Saudi involvement in the mediation wasn't altruistic. It was strategic. The kingdom used its influence with Washington to signal that Gulf states, which host American military facilities essential to the projection of American power in the region, were prepared to support a negotiated outcome and would not interpret a deal as American weakness requiring compensation. Turkey's role was quieter, but reflected the same pattern. A NATO member with deep historical grievances against the alliance's dominant powers, Turkey had spent years positioning itself as a country that could maintain working relationships with parties in fundamental conflict, with Russia and Ukraine simultaneously, with Israel and Palestinian factions, with Iran and the Gulf states. The credibility of this positioning rested on a consistent willingness to absorb the diplomatic costs of refusing to fully align with any bloc. In the context of the US-Iran negotiations, Turkey provided additional communication channels and helped manage the regional dimensions of the conflict in ways that reduced the pressure on the primary negotiating track. What this configuration of mediators reveals about the international system is more important than the specific roles each played. The architecture of global diplomacy is no longer organized around a small number of great powers whose bilateral relationships determine the framework within which everyone else operates. It has become a more complex network in which second-tier states with specific geographic positions, relationship portfolios, and institutional reputations can become pivotal actors in conflicts between much larger powers. This is not a temporary anomaly. It reflects structural changes in the international system that have been developing for decades. The proliferation of nuclear and advanced conventional weapons has raised the cost of direct great power conflict to levels that make proxy and mediated engagement more attractive than direct confrontation. The economic interdependence created by globalization has given smaller states leverage through their positions in trade networks, financial systems, and energy supply chains. The fragmentation of the international order that had been organized around American primacy has created space for a more genuinely multipolar arrangement in which influence is distributed more widely. Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey did not broker the June 2026 agreement because they are more powerful than the United States. They brokered it because they occupied positions in the network of relationships that the United States and Iran needed, and because they had built the institutional credibility to be trusted by both sides when the cost of misunderstanding was measured in the continuation of a war. That is a form of power. It is different from military power and different from economic power, but in the specific context of ending a conflict between parties that cannot talk directly to each other, it was the form of power that mattered most. The deal that emerged from this mediation architecture was announced, signed, and celebrated in the language of bilateral agreement between Washington and Tehran. But its actual production, the mechanics of how two governments that have spent 46 years not talking to each other arrived at a shared text they were both willing to sign, required every one of those intermediaries, operating simultaneously, managing separate relationships, and translating between political systems that define the same words differently. Understanding that mechanism is understanding how diplomacy actually works in the world as it exists. Not the world of clear hierarchies and decisive great power leadership that textbooks sometimes describe. The world where the most consequential diplomatic achievements of the 21st century have been produced by a Pakistani general flying back and forth to Tehran, a Qatari diplomat maintaining relationships that every other country in the region had severed, and a series of conversations in hotel rooms in Islamabad and Doha that never appeared on any official agenda. The deal was announced from Washington. It was built somewhere else entirely. There is a phrase that experienced diplomats use when they want to describe an agreement that looks more complete than it is. They call it a memorandum of understanding. The choice of words is deliberate and precise. A memorandum is a record. An understanding is a shared intention. Neither word means commitment. Neither word means resolution. And neither word means that the parties who signed it actually agree on what it says. The document that the United States and Iran initialed in June 2026, with a formal signing ceremony scheduled for Geneva on June 19, is a memorandum of understanding. Before examining what it contains, it's worth sitting with that classification for a moment, because the distance between what was announced and what was agreed is one of the defining features of this particular agreement. And understanding that distance is essential to understanding what happens next. What the agreement does, unambiguously, the clearest and most immediate element of the June 2026 agreement is the mutual cessation of active military operations. American strikes on Iranian territory stopped. Iranian strikes on American military assets, Gulf state infrastructure, and Israeli targets stopped. Or more precisely, Iran committed to ensuring that the military actions it controls or influences would stop. The naval blockade that the United States had imposed on Iranian ports was lifted. The Strait of Hormuz was declared open to toll-free passage for vessels of all nations. These elements are concrete, verifiable, and immediately consequential. The reopening of the strait, the single most economically significant provision of the entire agreement, was not deferred to a future negotiating session. It happened. Ships that had been waiting for weeks, anchored outside the danger zone, began moving. The insurance markets that had made transit prohibitively expensive began to recalibrate. The commodity markets that had priced in extended closure began adjusting in the other direction. The agreement also established a 60-day framework for negotiations on the larger questions that the Memorandum of Understanding explicitly does not resolve. This is the mechanism, a pause in fighting, long enough to create the conditions for deeper talks, with a theoretical understanding that if those talks succeed, the pause becomes permanent. What the agreement defers, and why deferral matters. Everything that made the conflict politically significant in the first place was placed in the 60-day negotiating basket. The nuclear question is the most consequential deferred item. Iran's nuclear program, the declared reason for the military campaign, the issue that had generated a decade and a half of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert operations, was not resolved by the Memorandum of Understanding. Iran did not agree to dismantle its enrichment infrastructure. It did not agree to surrender its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. It did not agree to a framework for international inspection and verification comparable to the one that existed under the previous nuclear agreement before that agreement collapsed. What exists, as of the signing, is a commitment to negotiate these questions during the 60-day window. The parameters of those negotiations, what Iran is prepared to accept, what the United States is prepared to offer in exchange, what third-party verification mechanisms would be acceptable to both sides, remain undefined in the public text of the memorandum. The gap between the parties on this issue is not small. Iran has never formally renounced its right to enrich uranium. Its position, consistently maintained throughout the negotiations, is that civilian nuclear enrichment is a sovereign right that it will not surrender as a condition of any agreement. The American position, stated publicly throughout the conflict, is that a deal that leaves Iran with the capacity to produce weapons-grade fissile material is not an acceptable outcome. These positions are not easily reconciled. The previous nuclear agreement, negotiated over years with the participation of 6 major world powers, managed the gap by limiting enrichment levels and quantities, rather than eliminating the program. A compromise that satisfied neither side's maximum position, but that both sides found preferable to the alternative. Whether a new agreement can find a similar middle ground, under conditions where Iran has accumulated significantly more enriched material and demonstrated significantly more willingness to confront American military power, is the central question of the 60-day period. The frozen assets dispute illustrates the depth of the gap even on questions that seem more tractable. Iran's position, stated publicly by its deputy foreign minister within hours of the agreement being announced, is that the 60-day nuclear negotiations will not begin until the United States releases billions of dollars in Iranian assets frozen under sanctions. This is not a minor procedural point. It is a sequencing demand that would effectively give Iran economic relief before it has made any concessions on the nuclear file. The American position, stated with equal clarity by a U.S. official within hours of the Iranian statement, is that frozen assets are part of the negotiating framework, not a precondition for entering it. These two positions cannot both be correct. Someone is going to have to move, or the 60-day window is going to open and close without the nuclear negotiations that are supposed to be its primary purpose ever formally beginning. This kind of contradictory public statement, both sides claiming victory, both sides asserting positions that are incompatible with each other, is a standard feature of the immediate aftermath of ceasefire agreements. It reflects the domestic political pressures that each government faces, the need to present the agreement to its own population as a success rather than a compromise. But it also creates a fragility in the early implementation period that can allow the agreement to collapse over procedural disputes before the substantive negotiations even begin. Lebanon is the element of the agreement most likely to produce an early crisis. The inclusion of Lebanon in the ceasefire framework, a long-standing Iranian demand, eventually incorporated into the agreement over significant Israeli objection, means that the deal requires Israeli military operations against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to stop. Israel is not a party to the agreement. Israel did not sign it. Israel's government has explicitly stated that it considers its campaign against Hezbollah unfinished business. This creates a structural problem that no amount of careful language in the Memorandum of Understanding can resolve. The agreement between Washington and Tehran includes a provision that requires the behavior of a third party, Israel, to change. That third party has its own government, its own military chain of command, its own domestic political pressures, and its own strategic calculation about what constitutes an acceptable security outcome on its northern border. The relationship between Washington and Jerusalem during the final weeks of the conflict was, by multiple accounts, severely strained. The American president's frustration with Israeli military actions that threatened to derail the diplomatic track was not concealed. The exchange between the two leaders on the day the agreement was announced was described by analysts with access to accounts of it as explosive. The language of allies who have reached the point where their strategic interests have genuinely diverged. Whether that divergence is temporary, a tactical disagreement that will be managed within the framework of the long-term alliance, or something more fundamental, is a question that the 60-day negotiating period will help answer. But the tension is real. And it means that the element of the June 2026 agreement that covers Lebanon rests on the assumption that Israel will comply with an arrangement it didn't negotiate and hasn't endorsed. That assumption may not hold. The proxy question sits beneath all of this, unaddressed. Iran's network of relationships with armed organizations across the region. The infrastructure of influence that it has built over decades in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere is not mentioned in the Memorandum of Understanding in any substantive way. This is not an oversight. It reflects the reality that this question is so fundamental to both sides' core interests that including it in a 60-day framework would have made the agreement impossible to reach. For the United States and Israel, the elimination or significant curtailment of Iran's regional proxy network was one of the stated objectives of the military campaign. It was not achieved militarily. It was not secured diplomatically. It was deferred implicitly, without even a formal acknowledgement that it is on the agenda, to some future negotiating process whose parameters have not been defined. For Iran, this network is not a foreign policy instrument that can be bargained away. It is, from Tehran's perspective, a strategic asset that took decades to build and that provides genuine security value. a distributed deterrent that raises the cost of any future military campaign against Iran by ensuring that conflict would not be contained to Iranian territory alone. What the June 2026 agreement actually is, stripped of the announcement language and the competing victory narratives, is this: a pause, purchased at the price of reopening an economically critical waterway and stopping active military operations. Structured around a 60-day window in which the parties are committed to negotiating the questions that actually matter. Accompanied by contradictory public statements that reflect how far apart those parties remain on the fundamental issues, dependent for its survival on the behavior of a third party, Israel, that is not bound by it. Silent on the regional influence network that was one of the stated reasons the conflict began. This is not nothing. A pause is better than continued fighting. A framework for negotiation is better than no framework. The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, whatever the political circumstances that produced it, has immediate and substantial economic consequences that benefit nearly every nation on Earth. But the distance between what was announced, a peace deal, a historic agreement, the end of the war, and what was actually achieved is large enough that the 60-day window ahead is less a negotiating schedule than a test of whether the gap between the parties' positions can be bridged by diplomacy when it couldn't be closed by force. A test of whether the domestic political constraints on both sides allow for the kind of genuine compromise that a durable agreement would require. History suggests that gaps this large, on questions this fundamental, are rarely closed in 60 days. History also suggests that sometimes they are. And that uncertainty, the genuine, unresolved uncertainty about what happens next, is itself a form of information. It tells us that the June 2026 agreement is not the end of the story. It is, at best, the end of the first chapter, the one that was written in missiles and oil prices and diplomatic backchannels and the geography of a 21-mile strait. The next chapter is being written now. In negotiating rooms, in military headquarters, in the domestic political calculations of governments that must sell whatever they agree to as something their populations will accept. What it will say is not yet known. But the mechanism that will determine its outcome is already clear. And that mechanism is what this channel exists to explain. History doesn't repeat. But it rhymes with enough consistency that the patterns are worth learning. The conflict that began on February 28, 2026, and produced the Memorandum of Understanding signed in Geneva in June of that year, was not, in its fundamental structure, a new kind of war. It was a very old kind of war, one in which a militarily superior power launched a campaign with maximalist objectives, achieved significant tactical successes, failed to convert those successes into the political outcomes it sought, and ultimately negotiated a settlement that fell well short of what the opening weeks suggested was possible. This pattern has appeared often enough in modern history that it has a name among the scholars who study these things. They call it the paradox of military victory, the phenomenon by which winning on the battlefield doesn't automatically produce winning at the negotiating table. Understanding why this paradox keeps appearing and what conditions determine whether it can be overcome is the larger lesson that the 2026 conflict offers. The first element of the pattern is the gap between military objectives and political outcomes. Military campaigns are designed to destroy things: infrastructure, weapon systems, command structures, economic capacity. They are very good at this. The history of modern warfare is largely a history of increasing technical sophistication in the capacity to identify, target, and destroy specific things from increasing distances with increasing precision. What military campaigns cannot do, with any comparable reliability, is produce specific political outcomes in the society they are targeting. The relationship between destruction and political change is not linear. It is not even reliably positive. Societies under military attack frequently respond in ways that are the opposite of what the attacking power intends, consolidating around the government being attacked, suppressing internal dissent in the name of national survival, and generating a narrative of resistance that can outlast the military campaign itself by decades. Iran in 2026 followed this pattern with textbook precision. The strikes that were intended to produce regime change produced regime consolidation. The military pressure that was intended to force nuclear concessions produced a government more committed to its nuclear program, not less, because that program had become inseparable from the narrative of national survival under external threat. This is not a failure of military planning. It is a structural limitation of what military force can accomplish in the political domain. And it is a limitation that has been demonstrated repeatedly across the history of modern conflict, from the Second World War to Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, and now to Iran. The second element of the pattern is the role of economic interdependence as a constraint on military action. The world of 2026 is more economically interconnected than any previous era in human history. Supply chains span continents. Energy systems connect producing regions to consuming regions through infrastructure that took decades and trillions of dollars to build. Financial systems move capital across borders in milliseconds. Food production in one part of the world depends on fertilizer produced in another, transported by ships running on fuel from a third. This interdependence is, in most circumstances, a stabilizing force. Countries that trade extensively with each other have economic incentives not to fight. The disruption of trade by conflict imposes costs on both sides that act as a deterrent. But interdependence also creates a new kind of vulnerability that changes the strategic logic of conflict. When a military campaign disrupts a node in the global economic network, a shipping lane, an energy choke point, a critical infrastructure hub, the costs don't fall only on the parties to the conflict. They fall on every economy connected to that node. And those third-party costs create political pressure on the attacking power from allies, trading partners, and domestic constituencies that are experiencing economic pain as a consequence of a conflict they have no vote in. The Strait of Hormuz is the clearest example of this dynamic in the modern world. Its closure imposed costs not just on the United States and Iran, but on Japan, South Korea, China, India, Germany, and dozens of other economies that depend on the energy that flows through it. Those costs created political pressure on Washington from allies who needed the strait open, from domestic consumers who felt the price increases, and from financial markets that priced the conflict's economic consequences in real time. This is a form of strategic leverage that smaller powers can exercise against larger ones, and it will only become more important as global economic interdependence deepens. A country that controls a critical node in the global economic network has leverage that is disproportionate to its military power. And any power that initiates a conflict without fully accounting for how that leverage will be used is likely to find itself in the same position the United States found itself in by April 2026, militarily successful and strategically constrained. The third element of the pattern is the compression of the political timeline. Modern democracies operate on electoral cycles, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, depending on the system. There is always a near-term political accountability moment that shapes how governments calculate the costs they can absorb and the timelines they can sustain. Authoritarian systems, and this is a genuine structural advantage, not a complement, don't face this constraint in the same way. A government that doesn't need to win an election in 8 months can sustain economic pain, military casualties, and diplomatic isolation for longer than a government that does. This asymmetry is not new. It was visible in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in every conflict where a militarily superior democratic power eventually concluded that the domestic political cost of continuing exceeded the strategic value of whatever remained to be achieved. Iran understood this. Its leadership had studied American political cycles for decades. The calculation that the approaching midterm elections created a deadline for American decision-making, a window within which the domestic political cost of the conflict would rise to the point where a deal became preferable to continued fighting, was not a sophisticated insight. It was a straightforward application of what the historical record clearly shows about how American military campaigns end. The 60-day negotiating window that the June 2026 agreement established is itself a product of this political timeline logic. 60 days takes the immediate pressure past the most acute phase of the pre-election period. It gives both sides enough time to claim that the process is working. It defers the hardest questions to a point where the domestic political dynamics on both sides may have shifted enough to make compromise more achievable. Whether that deferral produces a durable agreement or simply delays a return to conflict is the question that the next chapter of this story will answer. The fourth element of the pattern is the role of the international system in constraining the options of the most powerful actors. The United States in 2026 is the most powerful military force in human history. It is also, simultaneously, embedded in a network of alliances, economic relationships, and institutional commitments that constrain how it can use that power and at what cost. The allies who host American military facilities in the Gulf, and whose cooperation is essential for projecting American power in the region, had interests that didn't perfectly align with American war objectives. The trading partners whose economic performance was affected by the conflict's disruption of energy markets had interests in a swift resolution that sometimes conflicted with American negotiating positions. The international institutions through which American influence is exercised, the UN, NATO, the G7, the financial architecture centered on dollar-denominated trade, all created pressure toward a negotiated outcome rather than a maximalist military one. This is the paradox of hegemonic power in a deeply interdependent world. The more embedded a power is in the international system, the more alliances it maintains, the more institutions it leads, the more economic relationships it anchors, the more constraints it faces on how freely it can exercise military force. Power and constraint grow together. Smaller powers, Iran, in this case, face fewer of these constraints. Iran's economic isolation under sanctions meant that it had already priced in most of the economic cost of conflict before the first strike fell. Its limited integration into the international institutional architecture meant that it had fewer commitments to honor and fewer partners to disappoint. Its authoritarian political system meant that domestic economic pain could be managed through suppression rather than accommodation. This asymmetry between a powerful, constrained, democratically accountable actor and a weaker, less constrained, less accountable one is one of the defining strategic dynamics of the contemporary international system. And it will continue to shape how conflicts between these two types of actors unfold, regardless of which specific countries are involved. What does all of this mean for the world that comes after June 2026? It means that the pattern that produced the Memorandum of Understanding, military action, economic disruption, political pressure, negotiated compromise, is not going away. The conditions that generate it are structural, not contingent. As long as critical global infrastructure remains concentrated in geographically vulnerable choke points, as long as economically interdependent democracies fight conflicts on electoral timelines, And as long as the gap between military capability and political outcome remains as wide as it is consistently proven to be, this pattern will recur. The specific actors will change. The specific choke points will change. The specific political timelines will change. But the mechanism, the underlying logic by which military campaigns that begin with maximalist objectives produce negotiated settlements that satisfy neither side, is durable. It is, at this point, one of the most reliable features of modern conflict. Understanding that mechanism doesn't predict the future, but it provides a framework for reading events as they unfold, for distinguishing between what is announced and what is achieved, between what military success means and what it produces politically, between the opening statements of a conflict and the negotiated reality that eventually emerges. That is what this channel is for. Not to tell you what to think about the events that appear in your news feed, but to give you the analytical framework to think about them yourself, to see the mechanism behind the headline, the structural pattern behind the breaking news, the historical template behind the event that is presented as unprecedented. The 2026 conflict between the United States and Iran produced a memorandum of understanding that may or may not evolve into something durable. What it has already produced, with certainty, is a case study in how power actually works in the contemporary world. How military superiority interacts with economic interdependence. How geographic leverage can offset technological advantage. How political timelines shape strategic calculation. How international systems constrain even the most powerful actors. These are not abstractions. They are the operating principles of the world as it actually exists. And they will determine the shape of the conflicts and the settlements that come next. If that kind of analysis is what you're looking for, subscribe. Every video on this channel applies the same framework to a different set of events. The actors change. The mechanism doesn't. On the morning of February 28, 2026, the world watched what looked like the beginning of a decisive moment in history. The most powerful military alliance on Earth had struck. The supreme leader of one of the most entrenched authoritarian governments in the Middle East was dead before noon. The objectives were clear. The military capacity to achieve them appeared overwhelming. 100 days later, the two sides were signing a memorandum of understanding in Switzerland. Not a victory, not a defeat, a pause. Purchased at the price of reopening a shipping lane that the supposed loser of the conflict had closed and held closed long enough to force the conversation. This is not the story the headlines told. The headlines told a story of strikes and casualties and diplomatic breakthroughs and birthday announcements on social media. Those things happened. But they were the surface. The mechanism underneath, the reason why the sequence of events unfolded the way it did, why the timeline compressed the way it did, why the deal looked the way it does. That mechanism was operating quietly, structurally, beneath everything you read and watched. A 21-mile strait held more strategic weight than 900 airstrikes. Geography outlasted technology. Economic interdependence constrained military superiority. A 2-year electoral cycle shaped a 100-day war. Second-tier powers brokered what superpowers couldn't negotiate directly, and a regime that survived its worst nightmare emerged harder, more risk-tolerant, and more convinced of its own durability than the one that existed before the first bomb fell. None of these outcomes were predetermined. Each of them followed from structural conditions that existed before the conflict began, conditions that were visible, analyzable, and explicable to anyone looking at the right level of the system rather than at the noise on the surface. That is the discipline this channel is committed to. Not reaction, not opinion, not the comfort of a clean narrative, where the good actors win and the bad actors lose, and the world arrives at a resolution that makes sense by the end of the episode. The world doesn't work that way. It never has. And anyone who has watched the events of 2026 unfold and felt confused about why a militarily dominant power ended up at the table negotiating with the government it tried to remove, that confusion is information. It's the signal that the framework most people use to interpret these events isn't adequate to the reality of how power actually operates. The June 2026 agreement will evolve. The 60-day window will produce something: a deeper agreement, a collapse, an extension, a return to conflict, or some combination of all of these that doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. Israel's position will shift in ways that are difficult to predict. The nuclear question will generate new crises before it generates resolution. The Strait of Hormuz, now reopened, will remain what it has always been: a choke point, a lever, a weapon waiting to be used again by whoever controls the northern bank. The story isn't over. But the mechanism that will determine how it continues is the same mechanism that determined how it began, how it was fought, and how it paused. Geography, economics, political timelines, institutional constraints, the enduring gap between what military force can destroy and what it can build. These are the terms in which the next chapter will be written. And when it is, when the 60 days expire and the world learns what was actually achieved or failed in those negotiating rooms in Geneva, this channel will be here. Not to tell you what happened, but to explain why. That's the signal. Everything else is noise.